guest. Please welcome Cheryl Strayed to Livewire. Welcome to the show, Cheryl.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Well, it's great to have you. So I think, first of all, the question on everyone's mind would be, for someone who had never backpacked in her life before, what made you decide to hike 1,100 miles on your own?
Because really, I think I had this idea that doing so would be just like a lot of day hikes back to back.
Right.
And it turned, I thought I'd be coming across picnickers and barbecue. People would say, come on over here and have a burger. But what happened is, so I think that anytime I've ever undertaken a big endeavor, I do that thing where I idealize it. I think it's going to be easier. I forget to think the details all the way through.
And you imagined a lot of beautiful vistas and
I did.
Meditating.
Well, and that's it is. When I decided to take this hike, I was really in a desperate place in my life. I was being very self-destructive. I had sort of reached the bottom. And I was reaching for a spiritual quest. And so even though I did all the logistics and packed the food and planned, what I imagined the journey would be once I got out there was that I would be meditating on these beautiful vistas and so forth. And then I got out there, and it was much more physical than I thought it would be. It was much more grueling. I forgot about that whole spiritual quest stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and there's a great passage right at the beginning of the book that illustrates that a little bit, and I was hoping that you could just read that little snippet.
Sure. And yeah, this is from the prologue. And at this point, what's happened, those of you who have read the book, I've lost a boot. I've lost a boot over the side of a cliff, and then I just decided any reasonable person would just throw the other one over too. Because what's one boot without another boot? It seemed like years ago now as I stood barefoot on that mountain in California, in a different lifetime really, when I'd made the arguably unreasonable decision to take a long walk alone on the PCT in order to save myself. When I believed that all of the things I'd been before had prepared me for this journey. But nothing had or could. Each day on the trail was the only possible preparation for the one that followed, and sometimes even the day before didn't prepare me for what would happen next, such as my boots sailing irretrievably off the side of a mountain. The truth is, I was only half sorry to see them go. In the 6 weeks I'd spent in those boots, I'd trekked across deserts and snow, past trees and bushes and grasses and flowers of all shapes and sizes and colors, walked up and down mountains and over fields and glades and stretches of land I couldn't possibly define, except to say that I had been there, passed over it, made it through. And all the while, those boots had blistered my feet and rubbed them raw. They'd caused my nails to blacken and detach themselves excruciatingly from 4 of my toes. I was done with those boots by the time I lost them, and those boots were done with me, though it's also true that I loved them. They had become not so much inanimate objects to me as extensions of who I was, as had just about everything else I carried that summer: my backpack, tent, sleeping bag, water purifier, ultralight stove, and the little orange whistle that I carried in lieu of a gun. They were the things I knew and could rely upon, the things that got me through. I looked down at the trees below me, the tall tops of them waving gently in the hot breeze. They could keep my boots, I thought, gazing across the great green expanse. I'd chosen to rest in this place because of the view. It was late afternoon in mid-July, and I was miles from civilization in every direction, days away from the lonely post office where I'd collect my next resupply box. There was a chance someone would come hiking down the trail, but only rarely did that happen. Usually I went days without seeing another person. It didn't matter whether someone came along anyway. I was in this alone. I gazed at my bare feet with their smattering of remaining toenails. They were ghostly pale to the line a few inches above my ankles where the wool socks I wore ended. My calves above them were muscled and golden and hairy, dusted with dirt and a constellation of bruises and scratches. I'd started walking in the Mojave Desert, and I didn't plan to stop until I touched my hand to a bridge that crosses the Columbia River at the Oregon-Washington border with the grandiose name, the Bridge of the Gods. I looked north in its direction, the very thought of that bridge, a beacon to me. I looked south to where I'd been, to the wild land that had schooled and scorched me, and I considered my options. There was only one I knew. There was always only one: to keep walking.
Cheryl Strayed. If you've just tuned in, we're talking to author Cheryl Strayed about her book, Wild, From Lost to Found on the Pacific Crest Trail. You were in so much physical pain. Your pack was way too heavy for you. Why did you go on? Why didn't you quit?
I think because, I mentioned earlier, I was really at this place in my life where I was trying to save myself and find myself. And so I was trying to rebuild credibility, not just for myself, but to those who knew me. And I think that was my biggest fear, that I wouldn't keep going, that I wouldn't follow through. Because I felt at that time I had been failing so darkly that I could not fail at this. And also, I'm just really stubborn.
That's a good reason. And you were also in a lot of emotional pain, right, on this trip. Your mother had passed away 4 years earlier from cancer at 45, very young, and she meant so much to you. And it seemed at some points that the physical pain was somehow serving to teach you what real pain was, or differentiate from that.
Right.
Was that accurate?
Yeah, there was an interesting relationship between physical pain and emotional pain, and physical suffering and emotional suffering. And I think that one was the cure for the other. Before I went on my hike, I was so very much in the emotional. I was wallowing in those emotions. I was not somebody who was in denial or repressing my grief. And in some ways, it was like I was too focused on them. And hiking the Pacific Crest Trail and carrying that tremendous pack took the focus off of that. I couldn't think about my emotional woes when my feet were killing me,
yeah,
or when I was having to figure out how I was going to cover this ground to get to the next water source, because I was in the desert. And so it was this really useful perspective shift. And later, when I wrote the book years later, I was able to really reflect on that. To so many narratives, so many sort of ancient narratives about journeys, where those two kinds of suffering are joined together, the physical and the spiritual, or the physical and the emotional. Those two things work in tandem, and one alleviates the other, or highlights the other, or brings a new perspective. And that's certainly the kind of journey that I found myself on.
Well, and along with the pain came the fact that you were a woman hiking this trail on your own, and you ran into some scary stuff, but you had this mantra on the trail that was just, I am not afraid.
I am not afraid.
And you talked toward the end of the book about having the guts to be afraid. Can you talk about that, what you meant by that?
Well, I had to assert that I wasn't afraid. I had to say that to myself, because I had to negate the story that women are told about fear and solitude and adventuring through the world alone. Women are seen as prey, and I had to reconceive what it was like to be a woman in the wilderness alone. And so I did that. I had to insist that I wasn't afraid. And there is this point in the middle of the journey where I suddenly am just shaken by something that's actually quite small, relatively speaking. And when I realized I was afraid of that, I realized that I'd broken through to another level, I guess really of courage, where I could acknowledge that I could allow fear into the room with me, or into the pack with me, if you will, since I wasn't in any rooms. And and that was a really powerful moment, because it actually, when I said I had I was able to acknowledge that I was afraid, was actually a braver moment than when I was trying to deny the fear.
Yeah. Well, and something, you actually, during the course of the trip, you read a lot of books, and each time that you went to a new supply station, there was a new book waiting for you, because you had read and burned the book that you'd previously read because of the weight.
That's
so
right.
You wouldn't have to carry it. But there was one book that made it through the whole trip, never got traded or burned, and that was Adrienne Rich's A Dream of a Common Language.
That's right.
Why was it that this book was the one that you kept with you the whole time?
This book, and I'm holding it in my hands. Those on the radio can't see that, but it is
the
the book I
actual
carried.
book that you took.
It's an actual book that I carried the whole way on the Pacific Crest Trail. And it was this book a friend had given me a week after my mom died. And poetry really had been, poetry and stories and books, literature, had been the thing that saved me. You know, it was really my religion. It's there where I found the greatest consolation, the greatest truth, the greatest beauty. And this book in particular, I say that I, memorized many of these lines and these poems. They were like incantations to me. And so it is interestingly sort of the sacred text of Wild. And it was my sacred text during that time. And I couldn't bear to burn it. And I also just felt it was important. I had to have it in my pack, even though others wouldn't consider it a necessity. I did.
Yeah. Well, a lot of people didn't pack like you.
That's right.
Your pack was probably about 50 pounds?
Oh, no, it was far more than that.
Like 70?
Yeah, no, it was
75?
Well, just when I set out, like I began my hike in the desert, and it turns out there's no water in the desert, apparently. I didn't put that together until like a couple days before the hike, and then I realized I had to carry a lot of water with me at the beginning. So on the first day of my hike, I had 24.5 pounds of water alone. And then if you read Wild, you'll see there's this long list of things I took with me, including things like a foldable saw and a very large camera that's, and all these things that were very heavy. So I could not lift my pack an inch. I actually couldn't lift it, and I had to go through this rigmarole to get it on. And that was the paradox, is how do I bear a weight that I can't bear?
Yeah. Well, I was wondering if you wanted to read, for people who may not know this, Adrienne Rich was a very influential poet and feminist, and she actually passed away just this past week at the age of 82.
That's right. And the first night on the trail was this reckoning for me, because I set out with this pack that I couldn't even stand up beneath its weight. And I walked only about 3 miles through the desert, and I realized that I was in for something much harder than I had predicted. And so I pitched my tent, really just because I needed to get out of the elements, and I pulled this book out. And I read this poem out loud to myself. It's a poem called Power. It's the first poem in this book, The Dream of a Common Language, Adrienne Rich. Living in the earth deposits of our history, today a backhoe, divulged out of a crumbling flank of earth one bottle, amber, perfect, 100-year-old cure for fever or melancholy, a tonic for living on this earth in the winters of this climate. Today I was reading about Marie Curie. She must have known she suffered from radiation sickness, her body bombarded for years by the element she had purified. It seems she denied to the end the source of the cataracts in her eyes, the cracked and suppurating skin of her finger ends, till she could no longer hold a test tube or a pencil. She died a famous woman denying her wounds. Denying her wounds came from the same source as her power. And I want to say that Adrienne Rich died the opposite of that woman. Her whole career was about claiming and acknowledging that her power came from the same source as her wounds. It's a great loss.
Well, and you can see why that poem meant so much to you on the trip, why it spoke to you so much.
It did.
Where do you think that you'd be now if you hadn't taken this trip?
It's interesting, in literal ways. I walked to Portland. I walked here. Most people didn't walk here from the Mojave Desert. I did. And I finished my trip in Cascade Locks. I had 20 cents left. And I only really came to Portland because I had run out of money. And so, in some ways, that's how I ended up here. And really, I think the bigger question you're asking is, would I be the person I am today if I hadn't taken that hike? And that's a mystery. I mean, it kind of points to what Laura asked earlier when she was asking Sugar for advice, because we don't know what would happen if one thing didn't happen. Like sometimes I try to imagine my life with my mom in it. I used to not be able to imagine her, not in my life, and now I can't imagine her in it. The Pacific Crest Trail trek is sort of like that too. I think that I would have landed on my 2 feet regardless. But that hike transformed me in a way that I think has everything to do with what led me to this place now.
Well, it's a stunning book, and congratulations on all the wonderful things that are happening with it. The book is Wild: From Lost to Found on the Pacific Crest Trail. The author is Cheryl Strayed. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.